The old adage goes that we all make mistakes. Hey, it's okay that this stupid thing happened because everyone makes mistakes. And yeah, we do. It's this cool little side effect of doing just about anything in life, but most of the time, I'd like to think that the average mistake won't cost a company hundreds of millions of money and cause a lot of people to lose their jobs. I once poured orange juice on my cereal, but nobody lost their livelihood over it, and the only cost to me was some weird tasting breakfast. It's safe to say that some mistakes have more dire consequences than others, and may have even gone some way towards shaping the video game industry as we know it today. But seriously, orange cereal tastes really weird. Maybe it's because we give it too much attention, but when the gaming industry screws up, it screws up hard. And, there's always some kind of messy fallout and a dozen people pointing fingers at each other trying to put out the fire. And it's all documented for all of us to watch from a distance behind our blast shields. We are ruthless vultures, aren't we? And if you ever wanted a sign of the clear disconnect between developer and executive, look no further. Video games have had some wonderfully talented people working on them for most of their careers, but everyone is prone to the occasional lapse in judgment or letting an opportunity slip through their fingers. Or maybe it's the board of executives at the top attempting to tap into a current trend and missing the mark by a giant margin. Either way, there have been an awful lot of high-profile blunders from every part of gaming history, and I'm gonna try and talk about them without sounding too judgmental. I know we all make mistakes, but fuck, man. Why would you kill Luigi off like that? He had so much to live for. This new Smash Bros. Game is coming at a hefty price. I think it might be physically impossible to make this video without mentioning EA at some point. Not because they're the source of some of the worst mistakes the gaming industry has ever seen, but more so because they make a lot of them, and most of these errors have been fairly recent. Electronic Arts for roughly the last decade have made more of a name for themselves from their shady business decisions than from any of their games being just that good. I don't want to mindlessly dogpile and pretend that EA never did anything right, but they don't do a lot to help themselves and their public image. A smart man or company would look at how 2015 Star Wars Battlefront was received and elect to play it a little safer and more reserved with the sequel. Let's just make a decent game that gives the fans what they want, that steers away from the controversies of the first game, is the kind of thing a smart person would say. I'm cheaper than I sound. You have to remember that Battlefront 2 wasn't the first game to include loot boxes, or even the first game to abuse a pay-to-win system to nudge players in the direction of their wallets. This troubling trend was already well established by the time that EA weighed in last year with their trademark brand of taking it too far. If the last 12 months have taught me anything, it'll be that the Star Wars fanbase don't take kindly to their franchise undergoing radical changes and increased commercialization. And you have to give EA a bit of credit for making some changes with the sequel, but unfortunately, the new single-player campaign and graphical tweaks are outweighed by a cancerous growth of microtransactions that dominated all the press surrounding this game for months. Suddenly, it was spilling over into the mainstream news, and everyone had an opinion on the prevalence of loot boxes in modern video games. Belgium and the Netherlands threw their hats into the ring and decided that loot boxes were a form of gambling and therefore illegal in their countries. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, and therefore, maybe it isn't a mistake. I mean, it absolutely is, since it put EA's reputation through the floor and left Star Wars in this awkward limbo, but maybe it's educated the masses to the dangers and inherently Bellendian nature of loot boxes. Could be a small price to pay. It's hard to say if we'll see any change going forward and if the negative reception of Battlefront 2 actually had any kind of change in the public's perception of loot boxes and microtransactions, but it certainly had the most visceral reaction of any bit of EA's bullshit that I can remember. They even felt the need to apologize at this year's E3, so maybe they have turned a corner. I give it tomorrow? Console launches are a stressful time. For most people really, but mostly for the hard men and women who have to do all the work behind the scenes to ensure that a console is advertised correctly and meets shipping requirements, and generally carrying out a long list of actions that take a long time to prepare. Console launches are expensive and risky, and we have seen on numerous different occasions how badly things can go when not enough people are paying attention. Or when the board of executives are like, sell it for this much, except this much is in fact too much and no one's gonna pay that much at launch for a PS3. And no one's gonna pay anything for an Xbox One that can't play used games, has to be online all the time, and watches you sleep. And especially, no one's gonna pay for a console that comes out the day it was announced. Sounds crazy, right? Like, imagine if Nintendo released that Switch trailer and at the end were the words, out now. You don't know what the hardware can do, or what games it can play, or even how much it costs. It is business suicide that doesn't take into account the amount of time and effort required to properly prepare for the launch of a new console. It is a horrendously terrible idea. Well, this is exactly what Sega did when they launched the Saturn in North America. You had the CEO of American Sega standing up at E3 unveiling this new console and then like, hey, it's out on shelves right now. Don't believe me? Well, it's hard to prove because very few retailers actually received copies this morning, but oh, they're out there somewhere. You can chalk up this blunder to primarily a knee-jerk reaction to Sony releasing the PlayStation and apparently Atari with their Jaguar, forcing Sega to blow their load 4 months ahead of schedule and inadvertently throw their new console under the bus. Sega then went to show how much they learned from this by screwing up the Dreamcast launch in Japan and dipping out the console market not long afterwards. You can say what you want about the launches of the Wii U and the PS3, at least those companies turned it around in the end and kept making consoles. The Sega Saturn almost acts as this dead zone full of great games like Nights into Dreams and Panzer Dragoon Saga that very few people were able to play in the 90s. They were right though, Sega does what Nintendo don't. Some smart business decisions would be nice though. In this internet age, we are very quick to blame one individual for a mistake, and while there are plenty of scenarios where this is a valid line of reasoning, with large companies it's usually a lot more complicated than that. With huge industry-shaping mistakes, it's definitely a lot more complicated than that. There is but one time period where the collective shit hit the fan so hard that we're lucky there was anything left over. The formative years of the gaming industry in the late 70s and early 80s were an exciting time where hundreds of companies were getting in on this brand new endeavor of electronic entertainment. Games like Pong and Space Invaders had shown the way forward, and arcades were proving to be a very effective way of churning out the money. So everyone wanted a piece of the action and decided that the best way of doing so was to make a lot of consoles with their own exclusives and to do so with as large a profit margin as possible. So everything was cheap to make but expensive in the store. That doesn't sound like a bad idea at all. Why would you ever think that? Oversaturation is a slow and insidious killer, which is why I avoid it by ensuring that I subscribe to RabbidLuigi's YouTube channel and clicking the little bell to receive notifications of every new upload. But unfortunately, this wasn't available in 1983, around the time that the video game market started to collapse in on itself. It's often cited that Atari were the main culprits for providing the catalyst for everything to go so horribly wrong in this industry. It's even known as Atari Shock in Japan. And while releasing a shitty Pac-Man port and their infamously awful take on E.T. did not help in the slightest, there was a lot more going on here than just some bad decisions from Atari. The one big mistake was the group effort of oversaturating the market with too many games and allowing for only a few of them to rise to the top. Though it wasn't all bad news, since Japan remained relatively unharmed since their console market wasn't completely fucked, and out of the ashes rose Nintendo with their entertainment system. It's like with Battlefront 2, make one big mistake to improve the world going forward? It's a good gig if you can get it. You know what makes the world go round, right? Well, depends on who you ask. I personally quite like eggs, but I've since found out that society hasn't gotten to a point where eggs are treated as the priceless commodity that they should be. Until the apocalypse gets here and I can be the creepy Eggman, we'll have to make do with hard cash instead, which is exactly what influences 90% of the decisions made in any industry, let alone one that is focused on video games. It therefore stands to reason that obviously any decision that costs a company a large amount of money will go down in the record books as a very large goof that people will be talking about for years. Unlike Sony, Microsoft were able to launch their 7th generation console without tripping over and embarrassing themselves. That came later. The reveal of the Xbox 360 was a very of-its-time occasion. Microsoft booked a 22-minute TV special on MTV with Elijah Wood hosting, and they talked about how this is going to usher in a new age of digital entertainment, it's going to revolutionize the world, it's going to be really, really good. And it kind of was in the end, but it did stumble out of the starting gates. I didn't grow up with an Xbox 360 since, unsurprisingly, given half the games I talk about, my family was firmly rooted in the Nintendo camp and the Wii was just too damn enjoyable to look elsewhere. When talking to friends about what they had around that time, the conversation always seemed to lead back to their new Xbox 360 and how non-functioning it was. Hey, it was a great system that released at a cheaper price than the PS3 and is even being supported to this day, but the early models were riddled with technical faults that usually manifested themselves as the now legendary Red Ring of Death. For a long time I didn't really know what this was other than an ethereal plague that invaded homes under the cover of darkness to corrupt 360s seemingly at random before disappearing without a trace, like a scene from the Prince of Egypt. This early, poorly manufactured version of the console had a reported 54% fail rate, which doesn't do a ton to inspire investor or consumer confidence. Microsoft did as much backtracking as they could, ranging from detailed instructions on how to fix the issue, to ensuring that future models didn't suffer from the same heat-related problems, and even having to shell out over $1 billion to fix and replace all the broken consoles. I never experienced it firsthand, but the stories I heard from friends took over my perception of the 360 for a long time. The red ring is like one of those doors during the plague with the red X's on them. Stay away because there's some nastiness in here. At least the PS3 kinda worked for a while. If you had enough optimism and did enough arguing, you could potentially paint any of these mistakes as a necessary bump on the road to success. You read enough motivational quotes and there's a through line about learning from mistakes and using them as the turning point in order to move forward with confidence and renewed vigor, and the point I'm trying to make is that most mistakes you can bounce back from. It all depends on how big the error was in the first place. Microsoft shipping a very large amount of defective consoles? Yeah, it's fine, do better next time. The gaming industry nearly imploding in 1983? Yeah, it's fine, don't be so stupid next time. Oh. Nintendo accidentally creating one of their biggest rivals for market share? Oh, that's... You can't fix that. The 90s were a funny old time for gaming. If the 80s were a period of radical change, then the 90s were a bit more of a slow burner, mixed with a mad dash to have the best technology in place for the next generation of exciting three-dimensional video games with cutting-edge graphics. It was around this time that a freshly optimistic Nintendo were looking around for options going forward and landed squarely at Sony, who, at this stage, didn't really give two shits about video games. Yeah, they made all sorts of tech, but video games are complicated, man. With two massive Japanese companies talking to each other about the future of video games, Nintendo and Sony collectively announced a deal in 1991 to make hardware together. A deal that Nintendo went back on a day later to get in bed with Philips to use their disc technology instead. Despite this, Sony remained determined and pushed ahead to create the original PlayStation. Nintendo, meanwhile, shared some of their IPs with Philips for their CDI and fared a little less well, though that may be somewhat subjective. And in doing so, Nintendo accidentally created one of their biggest rivals in the console market. The story goes that Nintendo weren't particularly keen on sharing their profits with a company that had no experience of working on gaming hardware, and so the deal with Philips was outlined to put Sony in their place and to show them who's boss or something. Considering that the Philips CDI and its Nintendo IPs flopped harder than that new Titans trailer, it's safe and incredibly obvious to say that Sony got the better end of the deal. The sting of failed negotiations led to them releasing the PlayStation in 1994, as the SNES was reaching the end of its lifespan, and suddenly, Nintendo were on the ropes. They couldn't compete with this new console capable of amazing, trust me, 3D graphics and the disc technology that was such an important part of the whole relationship between the two companies, abandoned by Nintendo in favor of cartridges for the N64. Sometimes your ego gets a bit out of hand, and sometimes it creates more work for yourself. You just need to learn to share. This has been RabbidLuigi, and my favourite thing about all of this is that because it happened decades ago, we've got years of Sony doing their own thing to occupy our minds. That means that when you look at the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, it is the strangest thing in the world. It is a stark reminder how close we came to Nintendo and Sony and PlayStation working together. And nowadays, PlayStation won't even share their games via crossplay. You know, maybe Nintendo should get into bed with Microsoft. They seem way more fun. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.